Thank you for joining part 2 of this talk. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Buddha. Namo Amida Buddha. Namo Amida Buddha. Namo. Thank you. It was lovely catching up over coffee with other people's stories of Catholicism. I have some new stories I picked up today from people who are here. Thank you for sharing that. So I wanted to pick up on my introduction to Buddhism, thanks to a book given to me by a Jesuit priest, Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And so I started my journey. I started a career and took up my professional training in the UK. And I came across Zen. There were several Zen centers in the UK. And I started studying and practicing Zen. And it was kind of exotic, you know, these practices and the energy was quite exotic. And but it didn't really suit me. Because I didn't like being told what to do. That's probably why I'm the boss at work. I can you know, understand what we need to do, but I found myself kind of quite resistant to this transition from a guru kind of leader, teacher. I wanted to discover it for myself. And I wanted helpful guides and witnesses and, you know, fellow Buddhists on the journey. But I didn't really like that connection of, you know, at some point I might reveal this wisdom to you. I felt a little bit of a power game, and I didn't want to waste time with that. But then I turned to Tibetan Buddhism. And an amazing teacher called Akong Rinpoche. And Akong Rinpoche, you may or may not have heard of him, but he was a contemporary of Chogyam Trungpa, who was very famous here in the US. Akong and Chogyam left Tibet together and traveled to the UK. And they ended up in Oxford. And Chogyam was sponsored to take up academic study. And in order to pay for them to live and survive, Akong worked as a hospital porter. But he was actually the kind of higher ranking Tibetan leader. His monastery was Samye Ling in Tibet. First Tibetan Buddhist monastery. And he was the abbot of that monastery. And he escaped with about 300 monks, and only 13, 14 survived the journey. They died on the way. Some of them were shot, but many died on the journey. So he found himself in the UK with Chogyam, and Chogyam went off to university and became a bit of a celebrity. And Akong was working as a hospital porter to pay the bills and put food on the table. And then Chogyam came to the US when he started teaching crazy wisdom, as he called it, crazy wisdom, and came here, and Akong established a new Samye Ling monastery in Scotland. He was given a small farm by a Scottish woman, and he established a new monastery. So I headed off to Scotland to meet him, and as soon as I met him, I knew he was the real deal. I walked into the shrine room and I saw a man in cowboy boots and a hat cleaning the altar. And he was changing the water offerings. And I thought, he's like this crazy, eccentric little Tibetan man, you know, kind of helping around the monastery. And then when it came to the service later that day, he appeared as Akong Rinpoche in his robes. I thought, wow, you know, he's so humble that he's out kind of cleaning all morning himself. And he had a little bit of flair about him, you know. But when he spoke, he was amazing. amazing, a very, very, very special man. And he was formed not just by his experiences of having to leave Tibet, but he was formed by his experiences in Tibet beforehand. And he was the elder brother of two, and his brother was a monk in the monastery. So he was also looking out for his brother. And part of his spiritual journey was what he needed to teach his brother, how he needed to guide his brother. So this was really personal on many levels for Akong Rinpoche. So he was an amazing teacher, and I took refuge with him. And I studied under him for 13 years while I was working and progressing my career in London. And I took precepts. I became vegetarian. I didn't drink alcohol for 13 years. And I know some of you may find that hard to believe, but I didn't drink alcohol for 13 years. And I practiced a lot of meditation. I went to a lot of retreats, and I took part in a lot of services. And it was, again, a really wonderful experience because it helped me understand what I had been reading. What I discovered from Akong Rinpoche was that you can't really encounter Buddhism just from books. They are helpful. They're so helpful. And my goodness, we are so blessed now to have so many in English and to have so many amazing Western authors. So I really, really, really love my books. But I discovered I couldn't encounter Buddhism just through the books. I needed to be able to have a discussion with someone who was wiser than me and who could help me understand what I was experiencing. So Akong Rinpoche was really, really generous, and I owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. He was murdered a few years ago, I think 7-8 years ago now, in China. And every year he used to go to China with 2 suitcases full of cash. So the deal with Akong Rinpoche was he never criticized the Chinese government, ever. And in return, he was let return to his part of Tibet with 2 suitcases of cash to fund the orphanage, the hospital, and the school. That was the deal. As long as he never spoke out against China's government, they would let him return. And when he died, when he was killed, everyone was very distressed, and they said, "Oh, those terrible Chinese, they've killed him. You know, they've killed him. They said they wouldn't, and they've killed him." But they didn't kill him. He was murdered by one of his own monks. And I had met that monk. He had come to London. And what had happened was, knowing he was returning with the cash, this monk had come back to Tibet, and he was living in absolute poverty. And his family were living in absolute poverty. And some of his family members were really, really ill. They were dying before his eyes. There was nothing he could do. And it was unbearable for him because he'd been in the UK where we have the National Health Service, and he had seen what life could be like. And this was too awful for him. So his intention was to rob Akong Rinpoche to get some money to care for his family. But his accomplices with him were carrying knives, and it went wrong. And so they stabbed him and he died. But there was this very profound kind of teaching within the story of his death. We immediately jumped to the view it was the Chinese had murdered him. And actually, it was much more confronting than that. It was a monk that we had known and met, and he had killed him, and it had gone horribly wrong with his accomplices. And that monk and his accomplices were executed for his murder, which I know is something he would not have wanted also, which is important to say. So I learned a lot from the life of Akong Rinpoche and the death of Akong Rinpoche. And his brother is now still the abbot of Samyeling in the UK and of the various other centres around the UK. But in my last interview with Akong Rinpoche, he was really excited to see me. And this was not normal. Normally you would walk in and you would offer a kata, and then you would do prostrations and then sit on a cushion, and he was on a slightly higher chair, and you would ask questions and he would answer. But he ran to the door and greeted me and said, David, I'm so excited to see you. I have something really important to tell you. And I was like, Rinpoche, what is it? You know, he said, come in. And he kind of dragged me over to a sofa, and he sat down and said, sit down, I've got something really important to tell you. I said, what is it? And he said, I can confirm you are now 1% enlightened. And I started looking at it and I said, can you just say that again, please? Yeah, I can confirm. I've been so happy to tell you. You are now 1% enlightened. And I said, whoa. I said, do you mean to tell me after 13 years of not drinking alcohol, not eating meat, meditating every day, doing all these retreats, doing all these practices, you know, chanting Sanskrit with an Irish accent, do you really mean to tell me I am now 1% enlightened? And he burst out laughing. And I never saw him so happy and so giddy. This was like just hilarious for him. He was telling me I was 1% enlightened. So I asked him, do you mean I've got 99 more lives? And he said, no, it's way harder than that. What do you mean it's way harder than that, Rinpoche? And he said, well, I've always told you human life is precious. I said, yeah, you have. He said, the simple way to understand it is, if you were to jump out of a plane without a parachute, with a pencil and paper, and you could write all of Shakespeare's sonnets before you hit the ground, then you might be born again as a human. But it's much easier not to be born again as a human. And I'm like, hang on a minute, you know, it's not just I've got to face 99 more lives of practice, and now you're telling me that's not even going to play out like that. How long does this go on for? And he said, David, I made a mistake. I said, what was that, Rinpoche? He said, the name I gave you when you took refuge. I said, oh, he said, the name I gave you was Karma Samten Punso, which is Tibetan for perfect meditator. And he said, what I now realize is that if I tell a man like you that you are a perfect meditator, you believe it. He said, I have noticed you competitive meditating. You sit straighter than everyone else. You sit longer than everyone else. Even though I know your legs are numb, you sit longer than everyone else, and you chant louder than everyone else. He said, you're a competitive Buddhist. And what's happened is, I've given you this name as a blessing, perfect meditator, but the more you practice, the more you believe you're a perfect meditator. So what I've developed is not your insight. What I've developed is your ego. And again, it was like second milestone on the journey. Someone was lovingly calling me out. He really saw me. Everything he said was true. I hadn't realized it. I just thought this is what you do when you're a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner. You just keep trying harder and harder and harder. And maybe I wasn't expecting 1% enlightenment. So I was just, you know, again, being a really serious practitioner. And he was like, no, you don't get it. You've missed the point. And I'm sorry, because it's my fault because of the name I gave you. So he said, I think you need to do a Pure Land retreat. And I have just finished a new retreat center in the field over there. And it's called the Pure Land Retreat Center. I'm like, wow, he built that just for me? Amazing.
There's your ego again.
My ego kicked in again. He built it, and of course he hadn't built it just for me. He was a devout practitioner for Amitabha. And so he had built this wonderful retreat center. He said, you need to go and do a Pure Land retreat. So I did. And it was the most important part of my journey, because I had chanted Amitabha practices before, but I had never really listened to his story. I had never really listened to his message. I thought it was just another Buddha in a myriad of Buddhas. So I went into the Pure Land retreat and was really open to listening deeply because I had been called out and I'd been told, stop your competitive meditating. And everything changed. Everything changed. I thought, yeah, I really am such a fool that the path for me is a Pure Land path. And so I met some new great teachers, and Akong Rinpoche was always welcoming and always loving, but he, set me on a different path. And I came across a Japanese priest in London called Reverend Sato, and he has a small temple in London called Three Wheels Temple. And he's an amazing man, amazing teacher, retired professor. And so I started to learn about Jodo Shinshu from him. And then I started reading books by Reverend John Perez Kavopoulos from Australia. And those books really worked for me. And then I started corresponding with him by email. And then had the opportunity to meet him at some conferences, the European Shin conferences in Europe. And then I met Reverend Gary Robinson, who was our one Nishihonganji Jodo Shinshu priest in the UK. And he was a tremendous support and a tremendous guide. So what helped on that journey and to make sense of it were the many books and resources published in English. And I really want to make this point. It's so important. What the Honganji International Centre have done, and now JSIO, what BCA have done. For those of us in Europe, you're our go-to resource for English material. And that really gave me access to a treasure chest on Jodo Shinshu that we didn't have before. No one else had done that in Europe. So thank you. Thank you so much for that, because, if you're surrounded by it and you're in a rhythm of publishing and producing, not just books, but also materials and simple guides and leaflets, you might think, oh, this might be helpful for my Sangha, but please remember, it's also helpful in the UK and across Europe, because even though apparently there are other languages spoken in Europe other than English, most people do speak English. And so those resources, your resources, are powerfully helpful in people finding and following a Jodo Shinshu path. And then I did the correspondence course, the Jodo Shinshu correspondence course. And that was incredibly helpful for me understanding the teachings of the masters and Shinran Shonin, and properly introduced me to Shinran Shonin and our school. And again, the fact that was available online, but also being able to meet up for seminars. So here and in Europe, I don't know if you remember, but you came to Düsseldorf for a Jodo Shinshu correspondence course seminar. So you've made all these efforts for us, and it has benefited us enormously. And indeed for me and others has set us on a path to ministry, as well as the Jodo Shinshu path. So again, thank you. Thank you so much for that. So I shared with you that my story was from Christianity, Catholicism specifically, but I also had a good understanding of Judaism and Islam, because I'd studied the Abrahamic religions, and then Zen, and then Tibetan, and then my final destination in this life of Jodo Shinshu. So it's a bit of a zigzag journey, and the name I was given when I became Jodo Shinshu was Ocho. So when it crosses over sideways, it's kind of a perfect name, and doesn't make me feel egotistical, makes me feel a bit silly because I had to lose my way before I found my way. And I think that's the right name. And when I took Tokudo, I kept that name because I appreciate it so much. Now, important to say that if I was not feeling settled in Jodo Shinshu, I wouldn't be here. Having made the changes I've already made, I can promise you, if I was not feeling settled in my heart, I would not be here. I'd be out searching again. But I really do feel settled. I really do feel like this is home, that Sangha, our family, and that this is the path I will stay on for this life. So again, thank you for that. And I want to share with you another experience on my Jodo Shinshu journey, which is that I was in Japan on business in Tokyo, and I had spotted in Wheel of Dharma that the BCA were doing a pilgrimage to Kyoto. And the pilgrimage started the day after I finished business in Tokyo. So I signed up and I took the Shinkansen from Tokyo to Kyoto, and I met up with Bishop Umezu and a small group from the US who were on pilgrimage for Honko. This was January, and they were going to be at Honzen for Honko, and I joined them, and it was absolutely wonderful. Again, I did that because of the BCA's efforts to promulgate Jodo Shinshu around the world. I felt, yeah, these are my people. I will take a train and finish off my time in Japan and go to Honko. Wow, what an experience that was. I had traveled around Japan before, but I had never experienced anything like this. Kyoto at the time of Honko is like a whole different landscape that you step into. There are people buzzing around. There's 24-hour dharmatons. So there's people who've been up all night, there's people with sleeping bags, there's old people, young people. It's just this buzz that you ordinarily don't see in Kyoto. It was bitter cold. My feet, I couldn't feel them. I was quite excited about going to the service on the 16th of January because it's my birthday. So I was away on my own, traveling on my own, but with the BCA group, and it was my birthday, and I went to the early morning service for Honko. And I've always kept a diary, a spiritual diary, throughout my whole life. And what I wrote in my diary that day was this: in this place, at this moment, the veil between this world and the other world is very thin. And that was my experience at Honzan for Honko. In this place, at this moment, the veil between this world and the other world is very thin. I call that experience a mystical experience. And I've really thought long and hard about using that word, because I know there are risks and dangers in using that word. But I can find no other word for it. Having spent many years as a Catholic and as a Franciscan, then as a Zen, then as a Tibetan, I've gone through so many rituals. My goodness, I've gone through so many experiences. But the one time I wrote something like that was at Honzan for Honko. I've never written anything like that, ever, ever, ever before. And yet I've been exposed to all these different rituals before. And I share it with you because I want to encourage two things. Firstly, I want to encourage pilgrimage. There is an immense benefit, if you have time and if you have resources, there's an immense benefit in taking some time out to go and walk that path. And it's not just the services and being there on a certain day, it's what you encounter. I had never encountered so many people before just spontaneously saying, Namo Amida Buddha. Of course, I know that happens often at Honzan, but there were so many people and that energy in gratitude for Shinran Shonin. Everyone kind of felt high on it. So many people were saying, Namo Amida Buddha, Namo Amida Buddha, just spontaneously. And it was absolutely intoxicating spiritually. It didn't feel alien. It didn't feel put on in any way. It didn't feel like mass hysteria. It just felt like a natural flow from this world to the other world. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. But I also share that story with you because I want to ask you on your Jodo Shinshu journey to make space for the mystical. Please, please, please make space for the mystical. We don't need to understand everything. And if you feel it, if you encounter it, just sit with it. Maybe write it in the diary so that you can go back to it and try and sense make in other times. But please do make space for the mystical. And I'm not saying, you know, our tradition is a mystical tradition and we do these practices and we offer fire and we do this and we do that and the other. Not at all. Just with the Nambutsu. And if we think about it, if the Nambutsu was us replying to Amida Buddha in gratitude, you know, it's been given to us by Amida Buddha. We're reciting it back in gratitude. Amida Buddha is listening. This world and the other world, that's mystical. That's mystical. And when we say we're held, what do we mean we're held, we're embraced? The light reaches us from afar. That's mystical. I'm not talking crystals and angels. I'm talking Amida Buddha. I'm talking about the Nambutsu. And I just want to encourage you to be open to that. So you've heard a little bit about my story, and as I said from the outset, I'm not sharing it just to tell you my story. I hope it's helpful, but also in a European context, every member of the Shin Buddhist Fellowship UK was Christian, then Zen or Tibetan, and is now Jodo Shinshu. So although I was a Franciscan friar and had all these other experiences too, every member in our Sangha in the UK was Christian, Tibetan or Zen, and then Jodo Shinshu. So that's the normal path to Jodo Shinshu in Europe. And it's really important that we understand that if we're to support people on the path. So what does that do for people? Well, we spend a lot of time talking about letting go of practice. And we spend a lot of time talking about people not discovering new practices. There's a book that I'm sure you will have heard of called The Secret. 30 million copies of that book have been sold. It's published in more than 50 languages. The Secret. And sometimes people will say to me, oh, I think I get this Pure Land thing. It's like The Secret, isn't it? And I'm like, it is so not like The Secret. There is no secret. There is no secret, really, really, really. But people kind of think about Buddhism as a philosophy rather than a religion. People think about it as a kind of positive mindset. And it's so much more than that, as we all know. But because there's so much popular self-help stuff out there, and because there's books like The Secret about positive energy, attracting positive energy, sometimes people will think, okay, well, that's it. So if I chant Namo Amida Butsu, that's positive energy and something beneficial will happen in this life. You know, I'll get a better job, I'll get a better car, I'll fall in love. And so it's really important in the West, actually, that we're straight with people about what Buddhism isn't and what Jodo Shinshu isn't, because somewhere along that sense-making journey, they've probably also read The Secret or some other books. And if people have come on that journey, Christianity to Tibetan or Zen and then to Jodo Shinshu, they've got quite a bit of baggage to work through about practice. So first, it's the oddity of not having meditation in Jodo Shinshu. Then it's the fact that we have no transmission to make. And people do adjust. And that's why it's so important that for us in the West, Jodo Shinshu doesn't just become a study group. Liturgy is so important. So important. not just the teaching. It would be easy for us just to share the teachings and they say, let's study them, and then you just go home and you just say the Nambutsu. But that would not be a complete job by a country mile. So the teachings are important and the liturgy is important. And that's why chanting is important. That's why the tradition of our services is so important. Because just having the teachings, just having books doesn't hold you when you lose someone you love. Doesn't hold you when you're navigating a crisis in your life. And it's not enough to just say Seiden and Butsu to someone who's been Catholic and Tibetan or Zen and then Jodo Shinshu. We have to undo some stuff. And the way we undo that stuff is through teaching and services, through liturgy. So, you know, it's quite important that we now repay the kindness in Europe from both Japan and from BCA by establishing our Sanghas and doing services. And that's why some of us will hopefully go for Kyoshi soon, and why we will continue to put more time, more effort into not just establishing online communities, but also in-person Sanghas and temples. It's really important for our future. And I was struck when Umezu Sensei, Bishop Umezu, came to one of the European conferences. We were meeting at a university, and so we had to set up the altar each day. And a young man came out carrying the Yogyo, the scroll, wearing white gloves. And he unrolled the scroll and really respectfully hung it up and then bowed and walked off. And I remember hearing out of earshot Bishop Umezu saying, wow, I wish we remembered to treat the scroll with so much respect back in the US. This young English guy was setting up the altar, wearing gloves, white gloves, and then bowing deeply. And, you know, I think we have a lot to learn from each other, but perhaps more from our perspective to remind you, rather than teach you, of our tradition and why all these things are so important. I'd like to say a little bit about the importance of in-person gatherings and of why we will have temples in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, and we will work to deliver that. So the internet was a great invention, invented by a Brit, just saying. And he made it available for free. The Americans monetized it, just over there, you know, Google and all the others who are over there. You monetized it, fine. That's the way of the world. But, you know, some innovation is made with a really good heart. So not just the internet, but also the seatbelts. The person who invented the seatbelts made them available without patent. A Swedish inventor, so that we can all be safer in our cars. Could have made a fortune, but didn't patent the seatbelt. And the inventor of the internet didn't patent the internet, just made it available for everyone. So particularly with the pandemic, of course, we've had so much stuff moving online, and there are definitely benefits of that. Definitely benefits of that. But it's important we don't just fall into online Sangha. Because online Sangha is not a full connection. It's like if I was taking part in this, zooming in from the UK, we could have done that, you know, it would have saved some money, some flights, you know, CO2, I get all that, and you've all come here today. But I really think it's important that we get the balance right between online and in person. Because what I felt being met at the airport, what I felt yesterday having dinner with brothers and sisters, that's priceless. And so for all of our Sangha, one of the three treasures, remember, for our Sangha, it's very important that sometimes we see each other in person. If we lose a relative, we think, when was the last time I saw them? You know, we don't think, when was the last time I just spoke on the phone, or when was the last time I had a Zoom call? When's the last time I saw them? So we know there's a value in meeting in person, that connection. So in Europe, and here, I hope so too, we will see a better balance of in-person and online. Both are important, both are hugely important, but we need to get that balance right. And maybe we haven't got it right just yet. So please, let's be conscious of that as a reflection to share with you. And the other thing is, we don't need to innovate Jodo Shinshu. Jodo Shinshu is an innovation. Bodhisattva Dharmakara was the great innovator. Renyo was a great innovator, Renyo Shonin. We don't need to innovate. And it's funny because sometimes when I speak to other Buddhists about Jodo Shinshu, they say, oh yeah, that's that new school of Buddhism that was invented in California. And I go, no. And I say, yeah, the easy path. It's like a California thing, isn't it? I said, no. Let me tell you, 850 years ago. And then they go, oh, okay. And I say, you know, we have the 7 masters, you know, and you list them and you go, oh, okay. Some people really in Europe think Jodo Shinshu is like a Californian fad, like a diet, like you've invented the easy path to the Pure Land. And sometimes we think and we talk in Europe about, you know, should we chant in Japanese? Should we translate things? I think it's really important we don't. Of course, Dharma talk should always be given in the local language. Then people can hear and people can discuss. But it's really important, I think, that we share our tradition faithfully. So chanting in Japanese and doing the services we do the way we do them is really important. And I've reflected on this because I'm a big opera fan. In fact, I'm probably a huge opera fan. I absolutely love it. I was raised with opera and it's a huge part of my life. And if I go and see an opera sung in English, it's very different to an original written in French or German or Italian. You encounter it differently. And I kind of like having to put the work in to read the story and read the words. And I don't mind surtitles. But, you know, there's a difference in the encounter with an opera sung in Italian and someone singing it in English. So I think there's a power in us respectfully sharing our tradition in the way we have learned it, the way we've encountered it. And I don't think we need to innovate on that. I think we need to establish and embed and sustain Jodo Shinshu just as it is. And our explanations will be in English, our Dharma messages will be in English, our classes will be in English. But I think it's really important that we feel comfortable about that. And Japanese culture is so respected and so loved. We often say in the UK that Japanese culture is the highest form of Asian culture. That's just our view. And we say that as someone who's had a long relationship with Japan and much of the world, for good or for ill. So I think, you know, given that folk are really interested in Japanese culture, they're really interested in the Japanese way of life, including philosophy, we should feel comfortable with the Japaneseness of Jodo Shinshu. I think it's a strength. I don't think it's a barrier or an obstacle. I don't think it's an oddity. I don't think it's something we should feel uncomfortable about. And particularly in the West, for those who come from a Christian tradition, I think it's really important that we spend time not just on intra-faith, but also intra-Buddhist engagement. If there are Buddhists from other schools who think Jodo Shinshu is a Californian invention, it's really important to know we're not. And we have to engage with them, we have to participate with them, we have to debate with them, and we have to be present. And so I spend a lot of time engaging with other Buddhist communities, as well as other faiths. And we're currently working together to open a Buddhist centre in the UK that will be shared by the Tibetan Buddhists, Western Chan Fellowship, and Jodo Shinshu. So we will use that one centre as a gateway to Buddhism for people, and we will all do our individual practices and services. And we hope that will be of benefit to people to find their way into Buddhism and then to progress on their journeys. So there's a very practical element to that about how you make that happen and how you share costs and how you support each other. But we've had those straight conversations about each other's traditions. So we are respectful of each other. We don't criticize or tease each other about our traditions. But equally, people know if I'm doing a service, it's a Jodo Shinshu service. We're not going to do the Tibetan stuff. We're not going to do the Zen stuff. We're not going to mix it all up. It's really important we don't mix it all up. Because one of the risks for converts to Buddhism is fundamentalism. It's a genuine risk. So one of the ways to guard against that is not to confuse people. Just give it as we've learned it. And again, thank you, because so much of the resources from the BCA will really help us to do that. So we don't need to invent a new religion for the West. We will have shared Dharma temples. We will be comfortable wearing our robes. And I know sometimes we worry about terms like faith, and then we talk about realization. These are good debates. And sometimes, well, in the West, we talk about, should we use the title Reverend? Is that confusing people? Actually, the feedback we get is it doesn't confuse people. They kind of like it. They kind of like knowing you've been ordained. They kind of like knowing. So they would usually say sensei, but they also kind of like knowing. And it doesn't confuse people. They learn very quickly, we're not Catholic priests. They learn that very quickly. We're very different. But they kind of like it. And I think we should make space for that. There's some familiarity and some comfort. I haven't found confusion in that space. So we will, because our journey is different to yours, we will call our temples rather than churches. I've listened and I do get why yours are called churches, but we'll call ours temples. And we will use our titles, we will wear our robes, we will do our services. And what we've discovered is that there's an immense interest and hunger for this, particularly for people who were Christian, then Zen or Tibetan, and it's almost like the final run on that journey. So, I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other. We have a history of chaplaincy in the UK. I know you're developing that, you've done that in some aspects for a long time and you're developing in others. I think chaplaincy is really, really important. And I also think it's important that we have a mix of ministers from Japan and local ministers. I can remember some people looking at me funnily when I was at Tokudo, thinking, why is this guy here? What's he doing here? He's not from a temple family. What's he doing? It's really important. It's really important that we have a mix. That's how we communicate with people. It's how we engage. And in the UK, we're very lucky. There are 5 priests, 2 women and 3 men. And we're really conscious that sometimes when Luella and Caroline speak, they speak in a way I can't, and Gary can't, and Enrique can't. They speak from a different perspective. So we should be aware of these issues. And we should make space for them. And we will also make space for Japanese priests, because it's really important. It's really important that we learn from each other. So I'll finish with a message to say, I hope we can find pride in our tradition. Pride is a word that's used a lot, for all the right reasons. But I hope we can also find pride in our tradition and find confidence. What I find in Jodo Shinshu is not people with egos. It certainly helped me. I'm still a work in progress, don't get me wrong, but it's certainly helped me a lot with my ego. But I hope we can find pride, because there are people who want to encounter this, and it will be of enormous benefit in their daily lives, as well as at the end of their lives. So I hope we can feel pride, and I hope we can feel confidence, and I hope we never lose our true essence and connection with Japan and with each other around the world. It's important. We are greater than the sum of our parts, and it will be of help to no one if we are independent rather than being interdependent. We know that as Buddhists, but in the real world of having temples and being ministers, sometimes there can be a temptation to that. You know, we'll do things our way. It's really important we don't. If we have a worry or a concern, let's talk about it. Let's find a way forward together. But certainly, I know I speak for my colleagues in the UK, the immense debt of gratitude we feel towards Nganji and the BCA holds us faithful to sharing Jodo Shinshu with many, and we will continue to do that, hopefully for many, many years to come. Can I thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be here? I have really enjoyed seeing you, and I'm really looking forward to, I'm just a warm-up act, I'm really looking forward to Reverend Carmela and Reverend Melissa later today. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be very happy to speak with anyone over a cup of coffee as today progresses, or indeed, please feel free to reach out to me by email if I can ever be of help. I will reply. And I love hearing from people. Please join me in Gesho. Namo Amida. Namo Amida. Namo Amida. Namo.